You've heard about the Ukraine war on the news. But what if I told you the real battle hasn't even begun? Behind the frozen front lines, both sides are preparing for a dangerous new phase with advanced weapons and total war economies. This isn't just Ukraine versus Russia anymore. NATO, China, and global powers are now deeply involved, turning this into the biggest geopolitical showdown since the Cold War. The scary truth? Neither side can afford to back down. So why is the world acting like this war is winding down when all signs point to escalation? Russia has viewed Ukraine as part of its empire for centuries. The Russian state traces this claim back to Kievan Rus, the medieval Slavic federation centered in modern-day Kiev. Putin has repeatedly stated that Russians and Ukrainians are one people in his speeches. This view shapes how Russia interprets Ukrainian independence since 1991, not as sovereignty, but as a temporary separation. When Ukraine gained independence after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia expected it to remain within Moscow's sphere of influence. Ukraine signing a partnership deal with the EU in 2013 challenged this assumption. Putin called it a Western plot to pull Ukraine away. His 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians claimed Ukraine only exists because of Russian decisions like assigning it territories in 1922. Russian school textbooks reinforce this narrative. A standard 10th grade history book teaches that Ukraine's lands were gathered by Russia. It presents the 1654 alliance between Cossack leaders and Moscow as Ukraine willingly joining Russia. Another textbook from 2020 describes Ukrainian independence as an historical mistake. These materials prepare young Russians to see Ukraine as inseparable from their country. Meanwhile, Ukraine developed a stronger national identity after the 2014 revolution overthrew its Moscow-friendly president. Since then, Ukraine removed Soviet-era monuments and renamed streets honoring Russian figures. The Ukrainian language, once discouraged in eastern regions, became more widely used. This cultural shift alarmed Putin, who sees it as rewriting shared history. His hour-long speech on February 21, 2022, laid out these grievances days before the invasion. He called Ukraine an integral part of Russian history that was entirely created by Russia. He dismissed Ukrainian statehood as artificial, saying modern Ukraine was shaped by Bolshevik, communist Russia. The speech made clear Putin believes Ukraine belongs under Moscow's control. These deep-rooted beliefs help explain why peace talks failed. For Putin, Ukraine choosing independence threatens Russia itself. He fears it sets an example other regions could follow. That's why he refuses to accept Ukraine's right to exist separately. As Ukrainian identity grows stronger, his attempts to reverse it become more extreme. What looks like a land grab to outsiders is, for Putin, correcting a historical wrong. The war stems from these clashing views of history. While Ukrainians fought for independence 3 decades ago, Russia never truly accepted it. Now these competing narratives are playing out on the battlefield with consequences far beyond Ukraine's borders. The Minsk agreements appeared to offer a diplomatic solution when signed in 2014 and 2015. These deals proposed a ceasefire and special status for eastern Ukraine's Russian-backed regions. But from Ukraine's perspective, implementing them meant accepting Russian influence over parts of its territory. Zelensky later called the agreements a trap, designed to legitimize Russian control. Russia had used similar tactics before. In Moldova and Georgia, it supported breakaway regions that stayed frozen in conflict for decades. These areas gave Moscow leverage without full-scale war. The Donbass conflict followed this pattern after 2014. Fighting continued despite ceasefires, with both sides accusing the other of violations. Over 100 ceasefires failed in 8 years. Attempts to revive diplomacy repeatedly collapsed. The Normandy format talks between Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany stalled because Russia demanded Ukraine negotiate directly with separatist leaders first. Ukraine refused, seeing this as granting them legitimacy. Meanwhile, shelling continued. Along the front lines, undermining trust in any agreements. Russia framed NATO expansion as its core security concern. It demanded legally binding guarantees that Ukraine would never join the alliance. Western leaders saw these as attempts to veto Ukraine's sovereign choices. When diplomatic notes in late 2021 rejected Russia's demands, the stage was set for escalation. Final talks in early 2022 exposed the gaps. Zelensky proposed a multilateral summit to discuss security guarantees. Putin sent troops into eastern Ukraine instead, then demanded Ukrainian neutrality and disarmament. The last meeting between Ukrainian and Russian officials occurred in Istanbul in March 2022, but yielded no breakthrough. Several factors doomed diplomacy. Russia wanted Ukraine to accept territorial losses up front. Ukraine insisted on sovereignty first. Western powers doubted Russia's willingness to compromise. By treating Ukraine as part of Russia's sphere, Moscow made agreement impossible. Ukraine's growing military cooperation with NATO after 2014 further alarmed Russia. The failed diplomacy led directly to full-scale war. Russia chose military force when talks couldn't deliver its goals. Ukraine realized negotiation wouldn't stop. Russian aggression. With both sides convinced diplomacy had failed, the battlefield became the only remaining arena. Now the conflict escalates because neither side sees an alternative to fighting, the very scenario diplomacy aimed to prevent. Current battlefield realities reflect this diplomatic collapse. Rather than seeking new talks, both sides focus on military gains first. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in 2023 showed how war can escalate without negotiation. While some still call for diplomacy, the mechanisms that once contained the conflict no longer function. Without a ceasefire, the war reshapes facts on the ground daily. The front lines may appear stagnant, but beneath the surface, both sides prepare for escalation. Russian forces dig multi-layered defenses while Ukraine trains new brigades with Western weapons. This quiet buildup suggests the current stalemate is temporary. Military analysts note Russia now produces more artillery shells monthly than all NATO countries combined, while Ukraine awaits F-16 fighter jets expected later this year. New technologies reshape the battlefield. Ukraine deploys long-range drones hitting oil refineries deep in Russia. Moscow responds with glide bombs that obliterate entire city blocks. Both sides test AI-powered targeting systems that make drones more lethal. The next phase may involve Russia's hypersonic missiles or Ukraine's promised ATACMS with 300-kilometer range. These weapons transform what's possible. Ukraine's national identity evolves under bombardment. Where Russian once dominated in eastern cities, Ukrainian language signs now prevail. A December 2023 poll showed 85% of Ukrainians oppose territorial concessions to Russia, up from 55% before the invasion. School curricula emphasize Ukrainian history separate from Russia's narrative. This cultural shift makes compromise politically toxic for leaders. Russia mobilizes its entire economy for war. Defense spending now consumes 6% of GDP, with factories operating 24/7 to produce tanks and missiles. Workers assemble Iranian-designed drones in converted shopping malls. Western sanctions force innovation. Russia now manufactures machine tools domestically that it previously imported. The economy bends but doesn't break. Global alliances harden. North Korea supplies Russia with millions of artillery shells. Iran provides drone technology. China walks a careful line, increasing trade with Moscow while avoiding direct military aid. NATO countries accelerate weapons shipments to Ukraine, with the U.S. approving $61 billion in new aid after months of delay. These commitments suggest sustained conflict. Political realities block exit strategies. Putin cannot withdraw without admitting failure after promising victory. Zelensky faces impeachment threats if he cedes territory. With elections suspended in Ukraine and Russian opposition silenced, neither leader has flexibility to compromise. The war continues because stopping would endanger both regimes more than fighting. The conflict expands beyond Ukraine's borders. Russian sabotage attempts target European rail lines. Moldova warns of Russian plots to destabilize its government. U.S. intelligence warns China may send lethal aid to Russia. As the war's second winter approaches, the patterns point toward widening confrontation rather than resolution. What began as a regional conflict increasingly tests the world order. The Ukraine war isn't just about territory. It's a battle over history itself. Russia insists Ukraine belongs to its imperial past, while Ukrainians fight to define their future. When two nations wage war over shared memory, finding middle ground becomes impossible. Watch eastern Ukraine closely. Russia's next offensive could come when the ground freezes this winter. Ukraine's counterattacks aim to break Russian supply lines. These moves will shape the war's next phase, whether it drags on for years or escalates further. The stakes keep rising. What began as a regional conflict now tests global alliances, economies, and security. History shows wars often accelerate when they seem stuck. This one won't end quietly.